Hi everyone, so welcome to the third in the series of How to Teach sessions for parents of primary school age children. When I say primary school, I'm generally meaning between years 1 and year 6. For the sake of this lesson, this is taught around year 4 level, but it might be that your child needs support with this further up as well. If it's taught quite quickly at school and they need a bit more help with it, come back to it. If you're homeschooling and you can hit this at whatever age it becomes relevant to your child when they're ready for it. So this is how to teach converting decimals to fractions from the very beginning of this. My name's Nicola Ross. I am the owner of the Kit McGraw Education Centre at Sheffield Central. We support children in their maths and their English, both in the centre and in real time via the webcam online at home. As you join the meeting, if you could just give me a thumbs up and just type in the age of the child or children that you're with, so that I've got a good idea of where to pitch it and what you might be looking at this particular moment in time. Okay, so we're going to get on to the fractions decimals in a moment. Just before I do, I want to just run you through what your child needs to know before we start this work. Okay, so you need to check that they understand 4 concepts first of all, and they are these. Okay, so before we go on to decimals, they need to understand fractions. Fractions are taught from the beginning in primary school, so right from reception you talk about halves and quarters, and then that builds up until you get to introducing decimals into year 4. So the first one to look at is that a fraction is part of a whole. That's what a fraction is, it's part of a whole. So if a whole cake, I chop myself a piece, slice out, that slice is a fraction of the whole thing. Okay, that's the first concept to understand. The second one to understand is that all the pieces of a fraction are equal size. So you can't have one massive piece and one tiny piece. You're going to have them all the same size. Okie dokie. The next thing to be aware of is that the bottom number, the denominator, says how much your whole one has been split into, and the top number, the numerator, tells you how many you've got. All right, so if I show you what that means on here. So you've got 1/4, my quarter. So the bottom number tells me how much my whole one split into. It's split into 4 equal pieces. The top one tells me how many it's been coloured in. 1. Okay. Here, 8 is my bottom number, my denominator. Split into 8 pieces. Top number tells me how many I've got. I've got 1. If I'd coloured in 2, my top number would be 2. So as a recap, your bottom number is your denominator, and I normally say it in a silly voice because it helps to remember. So I normally say denominator, and it sounds a little bit like Terminator, and because you're saying low, it's a low number, it's low down. So that's your bottom number, and the top one is your numerator in a silly high voice because it's higher. So the only way I could think of to remember it. Okay, so then your last piece of information to make sure your child understands is that the bigger the denominator, the smaller the piece. Now, this is easy to teach when you are dividing a cake up. So if you're dividing a cake up and you say, I'll have half of it, you can have a tenth. And they'll very quickly notice that a tenth is a lot smaller than a half, even though the half has only got a 2 on the bottom as a denominator, and a tenth has got 10. Okay. Now, the good thing about all of this stuff is that it can all be taught practically. So you can teach this when you're baking, when you're making sandwiches, when you're cooking pizza. So I can have my pizza and I can divide it into halves, into quarters, into thirds, into tenths, whatever I want. So I'll give you a tenth of it, I'll give you half of it. Or would you like your toast cut into halves or quarters? All those conversations, do it all practically. You don't need to do a sit-down lesson on this. The only bit you'll need to sit down with, or maybe just jot down a bit of paper next to you as you're baking, is how to write 1/8, 1 out of 8, 1/8. So I've got 1 out of possible 8 pieces to my cake. That's the only piece you need to formally teach. The rest of it, do it practically. If your child is at the beginning of learning this, don't do the more than one lesson, just have one teaching point at a time. One of the questions we had previously was how long is a teaching session with your child? This will depend on your child. I would generally start with 5 minutes, especially if you've got a little one, and you just want one thing for them to understand. If they don't get it at all, they're not ready for that yet. So when they're ready, they'll understand it quickly. Make it play, like we talked about last week, make it enjoyable, make it practical, and they'll understand it much faster. Okay, so just give me a thumbs up if that all makes sense and if you understand the concept of the fractions. All right, lovely. That's great. Okay, so if it all makes sense, then we'll move on to the next bit. Now, the next bit is all about decimals. And just remind you to put the ages of your children you're working with, so I know what I'm doing as well as you join. So, converting decimals to fractions, this comes in year 4. So in school, when children are between 8 and 9 years old. It's quite early. It didn't used to be, it used to be a year later, but it's all coming a little bit sooner than we would like. But still, it's fine. It's fine. All right then. So last week we talked about place value. And place value, simply put, just means the value a number has depending on the place it's in. So if I have a pen, if I have a 2 in my hundreds column, it's 200. If I have a 2 in my tens column, it's 20. If I have a 2 in my ones column, which we used to know as units, but it's now 1, it's just 2. All right, now that extends into decimals like this. If I have a 2 in my tenths column, it becomes 2 tenths. If I have a 2 in my hundredths column, it becomes 2 hundredths. Okay, so it just depends which column your number falls in at the time. Now, when you're teaching this, I'm going to just change these to ones to make it easier. When you're teaching this, you can also talk about the placeholders. So you have to put zeros in to show which place your numbers are in, otherwise it won't make sense. All right, so let's go with the tenths. So I can say I've got no ones, I've got no whole cakes or whole pizzas, but I've got 1/10. Now you can demonstrate this with your pizza, pair it together, so pair together what they already know. So here is my pizza, my whole pizza, and 1/10 of it means I've cut it into 10 equal pieces and I'm eating one of them. Okay, so it's 1 out of my 10. There's a decimal that's written 0.1. All right, if I got particularly hungry and I ate 2 of those tenths, it would simply be 0.2, 2 in the tenths column. So I get hungry, I eat my pizza, and I'm going to eat 2 pieces. 1. Oh, no, not that one, that one. 2. 2 pieces gone, 2 pieces munched. And then you can say, well, how many pieces I've got left? And then you can do a little bit of subtraction of fractions as well. I've got 8 pieces left. Okay. So give me a thumbs up if that makes sense with the tenths column. Are we happy with that? Give me a surprise face if it doesn't make sense, and I'll do another one. All right. Marvellous. We're moving on. So to move on, if you move then into the hundreds column, 0.01. Okay, if I've got 1 in the hundreds column, then that's 1/100th. So the way I write it as a fraction, brilliant, is 1 over 100. Because it's 1 in the hundreds column. If there's a number in both, so say you've got 21/100ths, what you do is you look at the number that's in the last column. So in this case, the hundreds, and you put the whole thing over the top of that column's number. Okay, so if I've got 2 tens, 1 unit, I put 21 over 100 because 100 is the last column that I'm using. If it was thousands, I put 21 over the thousands column. Okay, so you look at which column is the last number in and place the whole thing over that column. Does that make sense? It's a little bit confusing. Okay, happy with that one. All right, so then the next thing I just want to move on to is the next step that comes into place. You wouldn't do all this in one lesson. You'd do the tenths in one lesson, and then you'd play a game around the tenths. Places like Twinkle and just generally online, there's lots of printable sheets where you can do card games with this. There's board games on Twinkle that you can play with fractions and decimals. We were speaking about last week how it usually takes a lot of repetitions, around a couple of thousand for a brain pathway to be formed, unless it's done in play. And if it's done in play, it takes between 20 and 40 repetitions. So you want to give a tiny bit of information. I'll do a bit more. Do a tiny bit of information, and then do the game. Literally, and I mean like 2 minutes piece of information, otherwise you'll lose your child completely. They don't want to be taught by you, your mummy, they want to play with you. So give them as much information as they need to play the game, and then play the game. And you can always drop more information in as you're playing. Let me take you through that again. So if I've got just my tens column, it would be 0.2. 2 in the tenths column would be 2 tenths. I just put the 2 over the 10. Okay. If I have a number in the hundreds column, it would be 0.01 if it was just in the hundreds column. And that would be 1 over 100. Written like that. Okay. The time, where do I go that way? The time it becomes complicated is if you have a number in the tenths and the hundreds column. But all you do then is you look at what column the last number is in. So in this case, my last number is in the hundreds column, and I put both of those numbers over 100, which gives me 21 over 100. All right. Watch the video a few times. So I was thinking, you can draw these out. This is why I'm just doing it with whiteboards, because you don't need fancy stuff. You can just draw it on a whiteboard, draw it on a bit of paper. Generally, the children write this a lot in their books, and then they just slide the numbers in and work it out that way. And eventually, again, they'll internalize it. All right, so that's how you convert just a simple tenths, hundreds, thousands to fractions. Just stick it over the tenth, or 100, or 1,000, depending on which column it's in. Excellent. I'm loving that it makes sense. All right. Moving on then. The next thing to tell you about is something called cancelling down. Okay. So this is going to come in a little bit later on, not this lesson, a couple of lessons down the line. And when you've converted a decimal to a fraction, you always have to cancel it down in its lowest terms, in its simplest form, in whatever way that might be. So the way you do this is the question that you'll probably get is something like, what is 0.2 as a fraction in its simplest form or in its lowest terms? So the first bit, what is 0.2 as a fraction, is the bit we've just done. So we've just done 0.2 is a 2 in the tenths column. I'm going to move that way, but it's going to see. There we are. The 2 in the tenths column, so it'd be 2 tenths. All right. To cancel it down, you're basically looking at equivalent fractions. So what's the lowest equivalent fraction? If they're just starting to do equivalents, you're going to want a fraction wall, which will show you all the equivalent fractions together. There are lots of equivalence games again online, and on Twinkle has also got a computer-based online game and paper-based ones that you can print out for showing the equivalent fractions as well. And they work really well. Yes, 1 over 5, you've got it. So what you ask yourself is the top number and the bottom number divisible by 2, 5, or 10? Only give them those 3 options to start with, okay, because you don't want to overcomplicate things. Just keep it simple. So my top number and my bottom number, they're both divisible by 2. Your main teaching point here is it has to be the same number that goes into both. You can't have half of one and half of the other. Okay, it's got to be the same number in both. And it has to fit in without any remainders. It's got to fit in exactly. So I'm going to go with 2. 2 goes into 2 once. 2 goes into 10 5 times. So my answer is 1/5. So 0.2 as a fraction in its simplest form is 1/5. Okay, so your steps for that one more time. 0.2 is 2 in the 10th column, so it's 2 over 10. Is it divisible by 2, 5 or 10? It's divisible by 2, both are divisible by 2. 2's into 2 go 1, 2's into 10 go 5. So I've got 1/5. Okay, now very quickly, because we're running over time, let's have a look at this one, because this is one that was asked earlier as well. What happens with 0.5? Okay, so 0.5 as a fraction in its lowest terms. Now, you probably know that 0.5 is a half, but why is it a half? So it's worth going back to this. 0.5 as a fraction is 5 in the 10th column. Okay, so it's a 5 in the 10th column. Yep, so therefore it's 5 over 10. Is that 5 and that 10 divisible by 2, 5 or 10? They're both divisible by 5. How many 5s in 5? 1. How many 5s in 10? 2. So it cancels down to a half. Right, that's why it's a half, because it's 5/10 cancelled down. You can also talk about 5 being half of 10, 50 being half of 100, 50% being a half. If they're ready for those conversations, you can have them at that point. The last little thing I want to sneak in before we finish is something that you can talk about. 5 is half of 10. Every number that's equivalent to a half, every fraction that's equivalent to a half, the numerator will be half of the denominator. So you can have a little play with each other at this point and just say, okay, let's test each other. Let's see if we can find what a half is in 12ths. Let's see if we can find what a half is in 6ths. Let's see if we can find what a half is in 20ths. So a half in 12ths will be half of 12, so it'd be 6. A half in 6ths is going to be 3. A half is 20ths is going to be 10. And you can test each other, and then you'll have the conversation about odd numbers as well coming in there. Again, make sure you're playing this game between you. Give a little piece of information, then play the game. If the child looks bored or uninterested or tired, leave it. There's no point. They're not going to take any information in at all. The only way they're going to take it in is if it's fun and it's quality time with you. So a tiny bit of information, then play the game. Get them to challenge you challenge them. Work it both ways. Okay, we've got through a lot today. So that's kind of a couple of weeks of work there, if not a couple of months of work. And again, just follow your child for whatever they're interested. Let me know if there's something in particular you want me to cover next session. I do have a plan again, but just pop it in if you need to. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do it through Facebook, or you can visit the Kip McGrath website. So it's Kip McGrath Sheffield Central, and messages that way. If you have a child that you want to discuss more information about what we do and you want a bit more help, or book a free assessment with us, you can do any of those things, or you can call us on 01142 700 303 and we can have a chat about where you're up to and what you'd like. Okay, lovely. Well, thank you ever so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week at 8:15. Thank you. Bye-bye.